Good morning. It is 9:10, so we are going to get started. And I asked Karl for just one quick moment, and it's only to do this, which is to thank him for offering this. We are so blessed, and I am just so grateful for your willingness to share your expertise and your perspectives. And these conversations are not easy to have, and to have someone who can guide this in such a beautiful, knowledgeable way is a real gift. So that was all I wanted to say, is just a thank you, Karl.
Thank you, Carmen. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I'm always grateful when somebody comes the first time and kind of surprised when they come back the second time. Can't say you weren't warned, but I am glad to see you here, and thank you for sharing in this conversation. So 2 weeks ago, we talked about the origins and development of Zionism. As the most quick recap, let me just mention a couple of things there and then move ahead. We talked about Zionism as a movement within modern Jewry that attempted to respond to the dual threats of anti-Semitism and assimilation that grew out of the Enlightenment. We saw the dominant forms there to be a political or national Zionism, led by Theodor Herzl, and cultural Zionism, led by Ahad Ha'am. We noted certain criticisms of Zionism that occurred within Jewry: the neglect of religion, the ignoral of the Arab question, and the failure to take seriously the diaspora as a fact, and for some, a goal. We indicated several implications of all of this for the current conversation. First was that the critique of Zionist politics were not necessarily anti-Semitic, could be, but weren't necessarily so. We noted a problematic relation to Scripture and suggested that the Holocaust was confirmation of Herzl's fear of anti-Semitism among enlightened nations. But we also noted that this provided a difficult analogy to complete in light of Israeli political power. And then the fire alarm went off. I promise I didn't schedule that one. If questions get hot, though, I may tell somebody to go burn a bear claw. We'll see how that goes. The context for today's comments, back in late October, over at the college, I was asked to be part of a panel jointly sponsored by the Jewish Student Organization and the Middle and Near Eastern Student Association. This event reflected both the need for conversation around the events of October 7th and their aftermath, as well as the difficulty for having that conversation. My contribution was to propose a set of guidelines or perspective from which conversation might proceed. In putting these guidelines together, I drew on the writings of Martin Buber and Emmanuel Levinas, two giants of 20th century philosophy. Frankly, there are a lot of weedy versions of that, and that's not what's going to happen today. I've got footnotes if you need them, but I doubt that you will. What I want to do this morning is to try to state as simply and as directly as I can certain axioms or kind of thesis statements that might shape discourse about the war. I offer them here with the sense that the church, as a witness and a participant, faces the same needs as those college students in seeking out an adequate language to say what needs to be said, and in speaking together to discover the claim of the unfolding situation. One caveat, I mean, I'll admit at the front end that this may seem idiosyncratic. It certainly is. Others may do this quite differently. This is just kind of the way I tend to rock and roll on these issues, or I would say on most issues generally. So anyway, 5 axioms for talking about the Israeli-Hamas war. Or I might even say 5 axioms for listening to conversation about the Israeli-Hamas war. First, everybody knows somebody. The Jewish writer Dara Horn, in her October New York Times op-ed entitled "Why Jews Cannot Stop Shaking Right Now," spoke of the intensification of Jewish anxiety after October 7th that reflected the traumatic memories of European pogroms and the stark surge of anti-Semitism in America and abroad. That surge one of you spoke of after the session last time is a tsunami, and I think that's probably an accurate way of putting it. These points that Dara Horn makes are compelling and frankly echo Herzl's perception of things after the Dreyfus affair. But she adds an additional nuance that I want to bring into play here at the outset. It seems fresh to me and worth considering. For diaspora Jews, she writes, these were not distant overseas events. In short, she says, everybody knows somebody. Everybody knows somebody. A fact of globalization, if not a more telling disclosure about religious communities, is this inability to see the events of October 7th in an abstract way, as if it were about someone else who lives far away. Everybody knows somebody, and so we call to mind particular names and faces of Israelis and Palestinians who are impacted as if they were our family members, our neighbors. In a globalized world, if not a theological one, they are precisely that. You know someone who is there, or you are at most at one step removed. Thus, we attend to these events as a personal matter. This came up at a discussion at the Pines where I was doing a similar talk, and someone said, you know, I'm from the American Midwest, I don't travel, and I don't know anybody. And I said, well, you're speaking to me right now, and I know someone. I can tell you of my student that graduated a few years ago, Magal Atias, who was one of our leading distance runners at the college, a young woman, Israeli, who returned to join the Israeli Defense Force as was expected, and I'm confident right now is likely in Gaza. Or you know Carmen, who can tell you about the Palestinian family that received her for hospitality as she hiked from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. You may be 6 steps removed from Kevin Bacon, but you're 1 step removed from Israelis and Palestinians. Thus, we approach this in a personal way. You either know someone who has someone particular in mind and is watching the news with that particular investment, or you yourself know someone. So second, this means above all that the war must be approached with personal language. In our speaking, we remain aware that these events involve at their core human lives, each with memories and aspirations, and a capacity to inflict harm upon one another or to receive it at their hands. And surely those things are related. With personal language, We resist the generalizations, abstractions, and ideological sureties of political institutions, and we turn to narratives of persons and their testimonies of what they are experiencing. The testimony of parents of a child taken hostage, the testimony of a family made homeless refugees without secure provision of food and shelter or physical safety. In hearing what persons say, we are obliged to listen as persons who have been entrusted with something that matters, something that may implicate us or call us to act in some new and decisive way. In personal language, the face of human beings comes into view and our own faces are unveiled. One little aside, it occurs to me, when I was talking to Jewish and Palestinian students, or Jewish and Middle Eastern students, I was aware of the particular vantage points from which they were approaching this. Another vantage point from which that we share, most of us here share, would be the vantage point of the church in Palestine as well. And so in that sense, there's that other door to open. What is at stake in the church, which is situated here as a witness in some ways, but also as a participant? And perhaps we can talk about that later as well. During the question and answer period at the college forum, most of the questions were policy oriented, which didn't particularly surprise me, given that there's, I think, around 250 or so students who major in political science. So much for the liberal arts. My partner on the panel was herself a specialist in Middle Eastern politics. And she had suggested, sort of elbowed me when we were going into the question and answer period, that why don't we just take turns responding? And I quickly knew what was ahead and said, no, why don't we wait and hear what the questions are? And so I found myself repeatedly whispering to her as the questions were unfolding, I think this one's yours. But then, at one point, a student took the microphone and addressed me by name and criticized me for using the concept war to speak of what was going on. She said, I stopped listening as soon as you used that word. I'm not sure I understood then nor now the substance of her criticism, and I could try to explain that to her. But I became riveted to her words as she spoke of growing up in Gaza amid poverty and insecurity, her deep worry about her family, and the helplessness of being at distance from them. Though she had started with a technical point about language, what emerged was nothing less than personal testimony that said in an audience-stunning way, I am suffering and I am afraid. In the sudden quiet that surrounded her testimony, this was what we as persons had to recognize above all else and before anything else might be said. Her personal word held priority, and I have no doubt that it was the most memorable word of the evening. 3, as persons committed to personal language, we should speak of the war from within a deeply dialogic perspective, as persons who stand in relation to each other as hearers and responders. And here I draw on the work of Martin Buber. This has several implications. First would be that our language must honor the two-sidedness of the conflict. Our prevailing syntax will be both this and that. Or in classic Jewish way, on the one hand and on the other hand. In speaking in this way, we may feel as if we are contradicting ourselves, or as if we don't know what we think. But this is not contradiction or uncertainty as much as the dialectics of complexity. And I believe that this is a litmus test that what we are saying aligns with the reality of the situation. The more our language veers toward a one-dimensional this and not get to that, or on the one hand without going to the other hand, the more wary I will be of that statement. Further, our commitment to dialogic thinking and speaking, listening, means the repudiation of zero-sum thinking, the kind of thinking whereby we assume that the gain of one side means loss on the other. This kind of thinking, which is familiar enough, assumes a competitive scarcity or finitude of possibility and is always antagonistic. If you get one more apple, I have one fewer. Someone always loses in this calculation. And the premise ignores the salient fact of this conflict. Here, both sides will flourish or fall together, such that Israel's security depends upon Palestinian freedom and Palestinian freedom upon Israeli security. Basically, that perspective that we heard from Jabotinsky in the talk 2 weeks ago. Accordingly, this dialogic perspective commits us to see that the reality of the situation is not a feature possessed by one party or the other, but is something that exists in the realm of the between, something that is manifest in their interaction, what they share together. It is never this one's or that one's, but theirs. Never mine, but always ours. To go to the Buber bit just for a second, this is his model of human relatedness. Thinking about a relationship, a significant relationship, you start to realize that how it is shaped and structured, what its meaning is really not a personal possession. As if there's you over here and the other person over there, and they've got, their basket and you've got your basket. But rather, the quality of a relationship, or what identifies it, is this between, what it shares. And the relationship is greater than what the features are of either person. That's what I'm saying about this as well, such that you stand or fall together. The truth cannot be mine, but it's always going to have to be ours. It's a relational matter. Otherwise, it's like having a conflict with yourself. That's real enough, but that's not what's going on here. Or a solution by yourself, which in zero-sum thinking is somebody else's defeat. So, everybody knows somebody. Personal language, a dialogic perspective. Following the thought of my other guy, this is 4, following the thought of Levinas, we should speak of the war from an other-centered perspective. So we've talked about, a kind of relational dialogic perspective. How am I related to that other person in dialogue? Levinas would say that you're always other-centered in these dialogic relationships. He draws implications from this The first would be that I must perceive in my other, even the other who is my enemy, the freedom to make an unconditional claim on my responsibility to be just. Levinas's parade example, his go-to example, is always this. He says the moment of ethical encounter occurs at the very moment the face of the other comes into view. He asks us to picture a man who has been knocked down in the street. As we pass by, he looks up from the curb and our faces meet. At that point, the ethical moment is already engaged. I am already obliged. His face asks, will you meet my need? My face reveals the answer. To pass by, or God forbid, to negotiate, already marks me as having failed the ethical test. When we speak of Israeli or Palestinian, it is this kind of face that appears before us, a face that asks something of us. I don't want you to miss the implication of this, and if it sounds sort of Good Samaritan-ish, I think you're picking up on the right resonances, except here the guy laying beside the guy in the ditch is actually, looks at you. The face comes into view. And Levinas's point is, oftentimes we start calculating our response. I said, well, I need to think about it. Who are you? What do I get in return from this? How big's the bill going to be? Am I going to get in trouble for this? And you can extend on out. It's very, the reflection can paralyze ethical action. And he says you're already engaged the moment you're seen. It's not something you choose. The other guy's face appears, emerges in your world, and at that point, in a sense, that person is your judge. They will be able to see by your face whether you respond in a way that does justice to them or not. That's why the ethical dimension is already engaged, and you cannot calculate it in advance. You cannot sit back and wait until the full disclosure of the implications of your actions are there. He says you act and you understand in the process of action rather than becoming certain about the knowledge and implication before you act. It's not that thinking is not important, it's vital, but that you don't do it always prior to the action. It's already engaged. So, picture the guy looking up at you, and and you start to negotiate. If I do this, can you pay me back? If I get close to you, are you going to hurt me? What's the bill going to be like? You sort of see the ways in which this starts to diminish and trivialize what the justice of your response would be. What this means, too, is that in this other-centered perspective, my need to do justice does not hinge on what the other has done or may do, but is an a priori responsibility. Accordingly, no just policy statement can begin with, because you have done X, I will do Y. Or if you do A, I will do B. The question becomes instead, as we might see in what's called virtue ethics, the question is, what kind of person, group, or nation do we want to be? Will we be a community that meets the just need of the other? This is the first and perhaps the only question. So that in this more virtue ethics way of thinking, your response to the other is not a function of what that other will provide you or the conditions that other presents. It has to do with who you want to be. And it reduces to a kind of simple thing. Do you want to be a just person? With what virtues do you align yourself unconditionally? Such that if you would not conform with those, you would no longer really be yourself or the self you would want to be. It would have stunning political implications if we went to that virtue position instead of, frankly, playing political grab ass all the time. You know, if you do this, what if it were a matter of, what is my virtue? What is the virtue I want to align myself with? And if I want to be a just person, then the answer is I will act in a just way. Now, of course, obviously, that can get very, very complicated. But this takes you away from the sense that everything I do now hinges on a particular response of the other. I'm going to be a decent human being because I would rather be a decent human being than not. Somebody posed the example of, I forget whether it was one of the Batman movies, and I've seen none of them, but I'm trying to remember the example. Let's pose the example, Batman has the chance to kill the Joker. And he tries to think about it, say from a legal perspective. Well, that could get sticky. We don't really kill people. I don't have a right to kill. We could think about it in terms of consequences, but if I do, I may save other lives that the Joker would otherwise take. But then you go to virtue ethics, and all of a sudden, well, do I want to be the kind of person that's going to kill my enemy? And all of a sudden, there's a kind of clarity that emerges. So Levinas, in saying that this other has the ability to lay an unconditional claim on us, will be saying something of that sort. When I face this other person who claims me, whose face meets mine, the only response I can make has to do not with the features of who that person is, but with who I want to be. Okay, fifth, the ethical relation to the other in this way of thinking is not mutual, but markedly asymmetrical. And here's where he's a little different from Buber, who emphasizes, as you see in much dialogic thinking, mutuality. But Levinas thinks mutuality you've already kind of lost. I'd say only in this way can I preserve both the humanity of the other and my own humanity. The need of the other is prior. That other who needs me to respond is also my judge. In the meeting of faces, I see, but am also seen. Now, what does that mean? In terms of dialogue, the asymmetry means I am first of all the one who listens rather than the one who speaks or addresses. Think of your own experience of committee meetings if you want to go to the horror show. And think of the dynamics of how those two often go. Speaking first too easily becomes a form of controlling the agenda or setting the terms of the dialogue. It's an exercise of power. If I'm to understand this situation I share and that is personal, I must hear the different word that only the other can speak, and thus not set in advance something that controls that word. This may seem to be a strange example, but I think I can connect it, and it works for me. Bear with me. Rabbinic law on capital cases say murder cases for which the death penalty would have been at stake in the ancient world as now, offers a telling example of this kind of asymmetry and the importance of listening before speaking. Against our common expectation, the rabbis argue that while it's permissible for a defendant to be acquitted by a unanimous vote, such a defendant whose life is at stake cannot be convicted unanimously. Here's the assumption. The assumption is that unanimity means you have not listened closely enough, or that you have surrounded yourself only with those who think the same as you do. A disguised form of speaking first. In such an important matter, the listener must listen until the vital points of difference are disclosed, and must allow them to present themselves in their own right. I cannot know what others have to say until I let them say it. I cannot respond until I listen. Obviously somebody goes first, I know that, but perhaps the first thing you say is, what do you think? Or takes the form of a question or something that invites. Otherwise, we're Archie and Edith trying to get through the door together. I know the pragmatics of this, but the priority of listening is here what I want to emphasize. And that, I guess the other part of that assumption, it assumes that difference is always there. That refocuses the goal of our conversations or in our peacemaking. What is the goal that we have? It may not be unanimity in the room. It may not be a kind of accord in which, we finally all agree on everything. I think if that were achievable, it probably would have happened by now. It's not unanimity as if all differences will go away, but recognition of the difference and fashioning a peaceful way of living within its constraints, if not, in fact, embracing it. So we take 11 to 1 or 10 to 2. 7 to 5, whatever you want. But be wary of that unanimous vote. Listen for the difference. This reminds us that in dialogue, as in human relations generally, categories of power are always in play. We must be mindful of the direction in which power flows. It's a given in relations that power is active and operative. You don't get to choose a no power situation, but you can be mindful of which way the power is flowing. What is the direction of it? If there is an absolute tenet lurking about in anything I say, perhaps it is this: one must never punch down. One must not use power against the powerless. One must not take the fact that you can grab the microphone first, define the terms, and control the conversation as a liberty that you should follow. Instead, one must ask, to paraphrase Howard Thurman, what is your word for those whose back is against the wall? Actually, I had to paraphrase it in the conversation at the college, given the pluralism of the audience. His actual quotation works even stronger in the church here. He says, I believe this is the quote, what is your word of Christ for those whose back is against the wall? In the situation before us, I would suggest, there are those whose backs are against the wall on both sides. Be concerned for them. Listen to what they say. Okay, no fire alarm, but there goes the bell. We've got ample time to sort of go into open discussion. I'm glad some of you came up to me during our fire recess and had wonderful questions. Revisit those. If there were things you wanted to ask from that session, that's fine. If you want to pick up these or anything related to this, a lot of holes I can step in, and I'll try not to step in too many of them. But I'm glad at this point to start to see what's on your mind and to see if this perspective or way of talking made any sense. Yes?
I agree with the dialogic perspective, and I think everyone can understand the concept of both people on both sides having their backs up against the wall. I think it's a great framework. The problem that I really see is at the core of the situation, you have people that do not think that way. Each side has a stated objective to destroy, not live peaceably, not think about the other, actually to destroy the other side. What will break that perspective?
That's an excellent question. I mean, if one could incorporate the dialogic perspective, we wouldn't have the need for the dialogic perspective in this case. So what we're seeing is anything but dialogue. We're seeing aggressive monologue, you might say, to stay with that metaphor. And the question was, how might one get that to shift? It does point to the kind of, I think, inevitable failure of the zero-sum thinking or the monologic thing. One can imagine an end in which one side loses or is overwhelmed, but that would be always a tragic kind of victory, a victory which is also a defeat. What gets us to the point at which that both-sidedness and their interrelation, which I think is so intricate here, to come together? I would go back at first to what I was saying about personal testimony and story language, personal language. The last thing you find coming out of the so-called diplomats will be personal testimony, because they don't always fit the ideological positions that are driving the monologue and the policy. So we go to a different part of our what part of my body? my mind, my heart, my soul, when we hear personal testimony. If you will, it invites a kind of conversion experience, a change of heart in the way in which I listen, and thus the way I speak. So that my first instinct, say over at the panel at the college, when the student said, "You're wrong in using the category war," was to go, "No, I'm not." And I could explain that in some sort of way, but I could not get away from the story she had told, which seemed prior, and to interrupt my desire to answer the question in the way in which it was posed. That sort of conversion, or going to reimagining the situation, as one which involves persons instead of positions, persons with names, persons with stories, instead of representatives of groups or statistics, would allow one to reimagine the possibility of dialogue. In fact, I could see that happening in the room at the college. It was not without a certain tension at start. These are students that have a great deal of personal investment. And yet we're caught in a kind of dilemma because these are their friends, their schoolmates, they live in the dorms with them and everything. They know these people, but all of a sudden, there was the tension of the opposition. And that was evident in some of the earlier questions. But when this student spoke, then all of a sudden, well, there were two responses. There was first, I think, a kind of go girl, a kind of cheerful response, a cheering response, but then a kind of stunned silence, as if we can't talk about this in quite the same way. And while I wasn't taking notes, I'm not sure anybody spoke in quite so bluntly or abstract a way thereafter. So I guess it would not be too much to think that what needs to happen is a conversion of spirit and heart that is reflected in the kind of language and hearing that one is involved in. And that's probably the only way in which one gets away from militant monologue. It actually, in an informal way, sometimes I think we overstress the religious dimensions of this. I'm not sure how active that really is, but it would be in an underlying way, a deeply religious challenge to think of this as an issue of conversion from a kind of way of thinking and speaking and imagining the world to thinking of it in one in which persons are testifying, saying, I am suffering or I am afraid. Probably the best I can do. Yes, please.
Is there something to be learned from what the Carter administration achieved in the campaign reports? As you spoke, I thought to myself, these are probably approaches that were taken at that time considering fighters.
So, can we learn from experiences like the Camp David Accords in Carter's administration? I want to say, surely so, and I'm quickly trying to remember all that involved. Simply even thinking of getting people together at the common table in a less mediated way would be one of those sorts of things. So all of a sudden, I'm not relating to a position, but I'm talking to another person. I think that certainly is a start. Those kinds of the things that characterize the Carter talks were remarkably two-sided. I'm trying to think the kind of style of conversation that would have been involved there. I sometimes think the best way to think about political discussion is in terms of family therapy. Or actually we can learn something from those models in terms of, say, if you have a dysfunctional family that can't get together to accomplish anything, you might start to push conversation in terms of what is it that you hold in common? Is there anything you hold in common that transcends this? And so my recollection was that, look, if anybody's going to get a night's sleep, if anybody's going to have any security, you're going to have to value that security more than you value the things that you're fighting about. And it's going to have to be accomplished together. So finding some common point that transcends the difference without obliterating the difference, enabling them to have some sense of a between that they can participate in, would seem to be a vital part of that strategy. But I guess, and I think this is part of Jimmy Carter's style. So that there was something about, we're meeting face to face here. Call me Jimmy. Can we get outside of President Carter and Prime Minister so-and-so and whatnot, and meet in a way that goes beyond the dictates of our offices? And that may not be the end point, but it perhaps is the best starting point and would lead to a possibility where something like the conversion I was speaking of could happen. So I think obviously happened. Sadat and Begin would not have been inclined to go out for beers after this, but they met in a way that was collaboration and genuine, and that was at least temporarily a game changer. Also, it occurred to me in thinking about what happens in a ceasefire. Would be another kind of example. Both sides had to agree to that. One side doing a ceasefire is not a ceasefire. So at that point, somebody had to recognize a common value and are hitting the pause button. That recognizing of a common point was a hopeful one. In fact, if I were to imagine what happens in a small way in a ceasefire, you start to protract out, and then after a while, perhaps you get there. But I think it comes by recognizing the common reference point instead of the peculiar one. Yeah, Al? Yes, sure, thanks. What were some of the causes that led to the October 7th event? And here I need to be careful to do my own on the one hand and on the other hand. I would resist saying there's some one cause. I don't think that's going to work. I think the package of causes is inseparable from the experience of the oppression of Palestinians in the territories and in Gaza. It's also inseparable from certain terrorist momentums in those territories, the mindset that that reflects. I think one of you asked earlier before the session started, did I think there was peculiar timing in this? The geopolitical situation would have turned the temperature up. The possibility of alliances in the Middle East, some may have wanted to disrupt, and that could have been on both sides, or there may have been investment from both sides. So one of the things that it makes me want to say is, we're thinking about this in terms of Israeli and Palestinian parties, and those are the major players, but those are also so full of alliances that the number of participants shaping this and thus shaping the causes would have been many. Go back to that first point. Everybody knows somebody. This isn't occurring in a vacuum at all. It doesn't happen apart from oppressive experience. I would say that. But also from the other side, what we see from this side as oppression is itself responding to a certain need that was oppressive. So as soon as I say oppression creates the problem, then you have to realize on both sides of the wall, there's history and experience of something which creates a need for either aggression or defensiveness, or defensive aggression. Aggression usually is defensive. I'm going to push you away so you don't get close. So this defensiveness, born of historical experience and living experience on both sides, would seem to be what cooks the conflict. Richard?
So can I try to follow on from that? I tend to be very analytical about issues like this, and I try to find the root cause.
Right.
So what's the root cause of conflict? And I found, because you're inspired with a little research, I found the press release from the King of England when the Brits were giving up the Palestinian mandate to the United Nations.
Right.
And what they described in a very apologetic and self-building way, but what they described was a trial and failure for any number of years, from 1913 to 1947. And the conclusion that I saw them making was each side would never accept the right of the other to exist, i.e. the right of Israel to be a state.
Right.
So when the Balfour Declaration provided the establishment of a new country, a homeland for the Jews in Palestine, that was never accepted, not once. So the idea of compromise, when the root cause is never accepting the existence of Israel, becomes a profoundly difficult problem to solve. And for 100 years, generations have grown up to deny the reality of that mandate, which was initially United Nations, later on United Nations, and then a country of Israel and its alliances. But the other side, so to speak, was always opposed to that and didn't want it ever to stand. So where do we go from the root cause to the relational problem solving and living together?
Yeah, that's very helpful in my sense of, let's go ahead and blame it on Britain. Or
There's something to be said for that.
yeah, it seemed to me the British move was kind of deferred maintenance. I mean, there was recognition of the tension. They were aware that what they were turning over was a boiling pot and could well be so, and a kind of hopeful wish, well, you guys will work it out on the ground. If you go back to Herzl, and I'm thinking about my colleague Andy Lustig back here, who, if we're going to get into ethics stuff, we need to get him up here. But Herzl's position, I thought he had a good understanding of the predicament, that one could not trust nations to protect the welfare of Judaism. So that he was right in seeing anti-Semitism as a problem. But he posed a nationalist solution, and I think that may be part of the difficulty. Nationalism will always draw that boundary that creates another side and antipathy. So did it go off the rails, or in terms of the root cause? What if we spoke about the ability to live in this place, but without constituting a nation? Or what if you thought of it in an international or binational sort of all those options? I wonder if nationalism itself isn't part of the problem. It leads you to think of a national solution, but in that case, this will always be a very defensive one that has built-in oppression to it. So the Zionist sense of the problem seemed to me on target. And I understand, I mean, you can hear Herzl, well, you got a national, if nations aren't doing it, we can solve the problem by creating a nation. It was not a silly, unreasonable move to make. But what we've learned is that nationalism also sows its own problems. So that, all of a sudden we think of, well, your example of the Carter stuff again. I mean, all of a sudden, you have a kind of transnational moment. or something more international, it seems the only door to go through. The logic of nationalism probably cannot succeed in this because, as you say, there at the root of this is something like a losing hand. But thanks for going back to the Balfour Declaration. I mean, that would be an important part of the history of this whole trajectory.
So, at some point, they have to move forward. How do you get to that new thing where these entities there can live together, can, both sides, but one side has to trust they're allowed to live, and also both have welfare, what they both want. They want to be able to live, they want to have families. There's an expression that one side said a while ago that they have to learn to love their children more than they hate us. Well, but at some point in time, I think what I'm hearing is you're saying there really has to be this new thing. The equation has to change. One side is all been about survival at the expense of another side being kept down. But when you go there, and a number of us have been there, you understand both sides, and it can just leave taking your heads. But how do you get to that new thing where you can get to trust that each side will get what they need? And one side feels secure, the other side will get to that point where Passover is never enough. It just seems in my lifetime, every year that's coming up to Karl, Helsinki or something, Oslo, it's never enough. And because of politics, it intercedes.
Right.
There's always some of this, and a little bit to be like, but like Ireland, sometimes there are people who just are in it for the fight. Some of them call it political people. And so they stoke the fire. The new thing has to occur.
The new thing has to occur, and the question obviously is how do we get there? I could point and say that's so far above my pay grade, and if I could do that, I'd have a different job. But if I had a strategy, it would involve, frankly, some of the kinds of things. I think the way out will be on a personal path. So the cultivation of experiences where personal dialogue occurs, where testimony is told and received, has more promise to me than military and political solutions which suppress that. And in some ways, it may mean that there's more of a cultural solution than there is a political one. So the cultural ventures that bring about personal encounter, in the same way you said when you visit there, when you spend time there, you come away with this two-sided thing. That would be an advance over monologic thinking. So how is it that people who are kind of quartered in one side can see what you saw, which was both sides?
Do you think that people may see that more than leadership?
Sure, absolutely. I think we kid ourselves to think that the vast populations on either side are happy with what's going on, and many of those have had the experiences that are personal in the sense we've been thinking. So I would put a lot more trust in most of the people than I would the political representatives of either. Yes?
When we were there this summer, one night we had a speaker come in who was Jewish. And it struck me that, and she was a PhD in her area of expertise, and it struck me, we had already traveled around the country quite a bit, and we had seen some of these areas that had, you're only allowed to drive on this road if you're this person, you have this license plate. We had seen the Palestinians
Yeah, it's difficult for us to imagine what it's like to live in a country with walls. Well, maybe not, but but the sense of boundary and endangered space is a whole nother thing. So I don't want to seem romantic or sentimental about that this would be easily accomplished to do. I would not want to give up on that. That's where I would place greatest hope. But in order to do that, certain walls and barriers have to fall in order to be willing and to create the space for that to occur. There's got to be a Camp David someplace. Yeah. Work of the Lord's going to go on the rest of this morning, so we probably need to let some of you get down on your knees and start your morning preparation, or let me bid you peace and thank you so much for your taking part in this.